Welcome to Storytime with Waterford Libraries. Today we're reading Ed's Bed by Eoin Colfer and illustrated by Woody. Chapter 1. 2 plus tables. Ed Cooper was a star in school. It said that in gold ink on his report. Ed is an absolute star and a joy to teach. Best of luck in first class. Signed, Miss Ryan. Ed could do anything. He could read third-class books. He could spell Tyrannosaurus. He could do forward and backward rolls. Ed Cooper loved school. That is, until 2 plus tables came along. Tables were new. Now everyone, said Miss Byrne. Why don't we say the 2 plus tables together? So they did, the whole class. They sang the tables like a song. Miss Byrne even let them clap along. But Ed got lost halfway through. There were just too many numbers on the blackboard. They seemed to move around like ants. And no matter how hard Ed tried, he just couldn't catch up. Miss Byrne noticed his red face. Are you having trouble, Ed? That's not like you. Ed thought he was going to cry. Miss Byrne smiled at him. Don't worry. You have all night to learn these, and I'm sure you'll have them off like clockwork by tomorrow. But Ed wasn't so sure if he could have them off by clockwork by the morning. He wasn't sure if he could learn them at all. Chapter 2. In the middle of the night. That night, Ed couldn't sleep. He'd spent ages learning his 2 plus tables, and he still didn't know them. He'd even tried to sneak the table book into bed, but Mum had caught him. It's time for you to sleep now, Ed, she said. If you're having trouble with your tables, I'll write a note to your teacher. A note for teacher, thought Ed, not for him. He was a star. So he told a little lie. No, Mum. 2 plus tables are no trouble. Easy. Glad to hear it, my young genius, Mum said. Now Ed felt even worse. Mum thought he was a genius, but he couldn't even learn his tables. When Ed did manage to fall asleep, he had a terrible dream. He dreamt that his table book had teeth like a crocodile and was chasing him around the classroom. His friends were all laughing so hard that their bellies shook. And though Miss Byrne was telling the other children off, he could see that she was dying to laugh as well. What a terrible nightmare! Ed woke up back in his own bed just before the crocodile table book snapped its teeth shut on his bottom. For a second, he was glad to be back. Then he noticed something. His pajamas were wet. It was almost as if... Oh no! Ed realised that he'd wet the bed. 7 years old and he'd wet the bed. Just like a little baby. All alone in the dark, Ed Cooper had a little cry. This was the worst day of his life. After he'd finished crying, Ed climbed out of bed. He was a big boy now, and big boys don't wet the bed. And if they did, just once by accident, they certainly didn't let their parents find out about it. Time for one of Ed Cooper's brilliant plans. Chapter 3. Ed's Plan. Ed rolled the sheet into a ball and stuffed it under his arm. He had to get rid of his sheet. He opened the bedroom door slowly and sneaked down the landing. You have to be very careful on the landing because of the squeaky floorboards. Ed knew all the squeaky boards because he once invented a game called Squash the Mouse. In this game, you had to stamp on the floorboards until one squeaked. Ed was a champion mouse squasher, so he made it to the bathroom without making any noise. Ed locked the door behind him and turned on the light. His brilliant plan was this. He would hang the sheet on the long radiator in the bathroom and hang his pajamas on the short radiator in his bedroom. Then all he had to do was get up and make the bed before Mum and Dad woke up. Brilliant! Ed wished he had a long arm so he could pat himself on the back. Then suddenly his plan went all wrong. Someone banged on the wall. Ed held his breath. It was Dad. Is that you, Ed? Or is it a burglar? Because if it's a burglar, I'll have to call the police. It's me, Dad, called Ed. Being arrested with wet pajamas would be awful. He heard his dad's feet plonking onto the floor. Oh no, the feet were outside the bathroom door now. Knock, knock. Open up, ordered Dad. I can't, said Ed. I'm going to the toilet. Fine, said Dad. I'll wait. Ed searched his head for another brilliant idea, but nothing would come. Where would he hide the sheet? Where? There was only one place, the cistern. It was his only chance. Ed stuffed the sheet under the water. Then he flushed the toilet and opened the door. Ed, what are you playing at in there? Nothing, Dad. Just going to the loo. Dad's eyebrows shot up like they did always did when he thought Ed might be telling him stories. Well, what was all that noise about? And why are you soaking wet? Ed groaned. He'd forgotten his pajamas were wet too. Time for another brilliant idea. I fell down the toilet. You what? I went to sleep on the loo and I fell down. Not all of me, just the middle bit. Dad's eyebrows shot up so high that Ed thought they might fly away. You fell down the toilet. Ed started to cry then, partly because he was sad, but partly to make Dad feel sad too. Okay, Ed, okay. Why don't you get cleaned up and we'll talk in the morning? Whew, thought Ed. Now all he had to do was get up early to rescue his sheet. No problem. Chapter 4. Water, water everywhere. Ed couldn't sleep for ages because there was a wet patch on the mattress and he had to curl his body around it. But in the end, he did gnaw it off and he was so pleased with his brilliant idea that there was no more bad dreams. He woke up because his toe was cold and wet. His first thought was, oh no, I've wet the bed again. But then he realized that his toe wasn't even in the bed. It was dragging on the floor because it was halfway out of the bed. Ed looked down. There was a big puddle of water on the floor. It was flowing in under the door. Oh no, the sheet! Ed jumped out of bed into the freezing water and ran down the landing. There was water everywhere. There was a river in the hallway, a pond under the hot press, and a waterfall falling down the stairs. Ed skidded along the carpet into the bathroom. Water was bubbling out from under the lid of the cistern. Ed waded through the waves and lifted the lid. The sheet was holding the refill lever down, so the water must have been flowing all night long. Ed pulled out the sheet and was immediately soaked. He slipped and splashed onto the bathroom floor. The sheet fell on top of him like a parachute. Help! Help! Help came quickly. It was Dad again. What on earth is going on here? Now, what Ed should have done was tell the truth, but he didn't. I saw all the water, Dad, and I tried to soak it up with my sheet. Really? Yes, Dad. Ed's dad looked into his son's eyes. Are you sure that's what happened, Ed? Ed wished he'd told the truth then, but it was too late now. Yes, Dad, I'm sure. Right so. If my boy says that's what happened, then that's what happened. Now you get cleaned up and ready for school. I'll fix this wonky cistern. Ed splashed down the stairs. He felt miserable now. He felt even worse when he remembered he still didn't know his 2+ tables. Chapter 5. Worry, worry, worry. Ed wished he could reach inside his head and squeeze his own brain. 2 + 3 equals, Miss Burns sighed. Don't you know, Ed? Ed shook his head. He didn't know. And to make things worse, he was the only one who couldn't say his tables. Miss Byrne wasn't one bit angry. Don't worry about it, Ed. Sometimes it takes time to get used to tables. You can try again tomorrow. That night, Ed dreamt about the table book crocodile again. And when he woke up, the bed was wet. Ed felt like a big baby. He had to make sure Mum and Dad didn't find out. Time for a new plan. Ed hung his pyjamas on the radiator and put on an old tracksuit. He dragged the mattress off the bed and leaned it against the radiator. Then he covered the bare bed springs with jumpers and climbed back into bed. Not bad, he thought as he wriggled to make himself comfortable. Doesn't look very comfortable to me. Ed didn't get caught that night, or the next, or the next. For 2 whole weeks, Ed kept drying the mattress against the radiator until it began to get a bit smelly. If he wasn't careful, Mum would smell it on her next surprise room inspection. He had to think of a way to keep his mattress dry. That night, Ed pulled all the old junk out from under his bed to see if there's anything there that could help him. There was an old roll of sticky tape with dust stuck to the edges, a plastic potty from when he was a baby, 2 bin liners full of socks, and a piece of a jigsaw. Thought Ed. He didn't think the jigsaw would be much good, but the other stuff... Ed emptied the socks out of one bin liner and taped the plastic across his mattress. Now, if he wet the bed, all he would have to do was get rid of the bin liner. Brilliant. As soon as he fell asleep, the table book crocodile nightmare started as usual. This time he could see right down the crocodile's throat into its belly. There were hundreds of children down there, children who didn't know their tables. Ed shot up in the bed. What a horrible dream. When he was fully awake, he realized he was wet again. Had his bed protection invention worked? There was a little pool on the plastic bag, but the mattress was dry. Ed decided he'd better go to the loo again before making the bed. He sat down on the old potty. It seemed a long way down, much smaller than he remembered. Ed yawned. It was all this worrying, and it was taking it out of him. Bedwetting and tables. He hadn't had a good night's sleep in ages. And before he knew what happened, he dozed off. Right there on the potty. Oh my gosh, Ed. When Mum came to call him that Saturday, that's where she found him. Fast asleep on the potty with no pyjamas on and a puddle on his bed. Chapter 6. No more secrets. The Cooper family had a meeting at the kitchen table. Well, Ed, said Dad, we have to think of a way to solve this problem. What problem? Said Ed. You know, said Mum, the bedwetting. Ed hid his face in his hands. They really did know. Dad put a spoon of sugar in his tea. Let me tell you a secret. Something I never even told your Mum. Ed sat up to listen. So did Mum. When I was about your age, we had to leave our house in the country and move into the town. I didn't like the new house with all the noise and the lorries, and I used to wet the bed too because I wasn't happy. You wet the bed? Gasped Ed. But you're Dad. I know, said Dad. It can happen to anyone, especially if you're worried about something. Are you worried about something, Ed? Ed thought about it. He didn't have to think very hard. Tables, he said. I'm worried about 2+ tables. Dad smiled. I had trouble with those too. You're getting more like me every day. And what did you do, Dad? Dad wiggled his 10 fingers. Well, Grandad showed me a little trick. Ed felt much better going to school the following Monday. He was glad Mum had found him on the potty. Now there were 3 Cooper family brains working on the problem instead of just one. Mum had made up some new rules for him. No drinking after 6 o'clock and a quick visit to the loo before bed, even if he didn't have to go. Dad said he would put the camp bed in Ed's room in case he needed to switch over in the middle of the night. And of course, Dad had shown him the Cooper tables learning trick. Miss Byrne examined the tables after break. Now, any volunteers to go first? She said. Ed's hand went up like a shot. Are you sure, Ed? Yes, miss, I'm sure. Okay then, off you go. Ed took a deep breath. Remember what Dad told you, he thought to himself. Put 2 fingers on top of the desk, and every time you say a sum, put 1 more finger on the desk. That will give you the correct answer. Ed had been practicing all morning. 2 plus 0 equals 2. 2 plus 1 equals 3. 2 plus 2 equals 4. Very good, Ed, said Miss Byrne. 2 plus 3 equals 5. Excellent. And he was excellent. Ed flew through those tables so fast that no one even noticed he was looking down at his fingers. And the best bit was the finger trick would work for all the tables, not just 2 plus. Miss Byrne peeled a gold star from her sheet and stuck it onto Ed's hand. Show that to your mum, she said, and you've earned it. Ed looked at his reflection in the gold star. He was smiling. It was the first time he'd smiled in weeks. Things were getting better. Now he could remember his tables. And best of all, he hadn't wet the bed last night. Ed was certain that if he followed Mum's rules, he wouldn't wet the bed half as much, and after a while, maybe not at all. Thank you very much for listening to our story. That's Ed's Bed by Eoin Colfer and illustrated by Woody.